The world in 1945 was forever changed. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, emerged from the ashes of World War II, each with a distinct vision for the future. But instead of cooperation, what followed was one of the most intense periods of rivalry in history. This is the story of the Cold War.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
The Cold War began not with open conflict, but with the deepening ideological divide between the capitalist West and the communist East. Following the surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945, near the end of World War II, the uneasy wartime alliance between the United States and Great Britain, on the one hand, and the Soviet Union on the other hand, began to unravel. By 1948, the Soviets had installed left-wing governments in the countries of Eastern Europe that had been liberated by the Red Army. The Americans and the British feared the permanent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and the threat of Soviet-influenced communist parties coming to power in the democracies of Western Europe. The Soviets, on the other hand, were determined to maintain control of Eastern Europe to safeguard against any possible renewed threat from Germany, and they were intent on spreading communism worldwide, largely for ideological reasons. The Cold War had solidified by 1947 and 1948, when U.S. aid provided under the Marshall Plan to Western Europe had brought back those countries under American influence. The Soviets had installed openly communist regimes in Eastern Europe. The battle for supremacy was waged not with bombs, but with diplomacy, espionage, and above all, competition. In the Cold War, one battle above all others was waged not through violence, but through science and technology. That is the space race. First mention of the space race was after the US announced the possibility of launching a satellite into space in 1955, and the Soviet Union did the same thing days later, and they were the first to successfully launch a satellite on October 4th, 1957, when they launched the Sputnik into space. After Sputnik shock set in across the US nationwide, Americans feared that the Russians would conquer space and have spatial superiority. Later that year, on November 3rd, 1957, the Sputnik 2 was launched carrying a dog named Laika, which was the first living thing to travel to space. The US launched their first successful satellite, the Explorer 1, which was launched on February 1st, 1958, 4 months after Sputnik was launched. On March 17th, 1958, the US made another attempt at launching a satellite, the Vanguard 1A. However, it crashed back down to the launch pad after improperly starting. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin was launched into space in the Vostok 1, making the Soviet Union the first to send a person into space. Yuri orbited the Earth once over 1 hour and 29 minutes, which also made him the first person to orbit the Earth. The US later launched the Freedom 7 on May 5th, 1961, which took Alan Shepard to space, making him the second person to go to space, although he didn't make it to orbit, and he only made it to suborbital. On May 25th, 1961, John F. Kennedy told Congress that the US would land a person on the moon before the end of the decade.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
The Apollo program was then launched, and it ran from 1961 to 1972, with its first crewed flight in 1968. On February 20th, 1962, John Glenn became the first American and second person in the world to achieve orbit around the Earth. Then on June 16th, 1963, Valentina Tereshkov became the first woman in space in the Vostok 1. She completed 48 orbits around the Earth in 71 hours. NASA then got a budget increase to the point that by 1967, NASA's budget was $7 billion. NASA also launched the Gemini program on April 8th, 1964. Its goal was to test astronauts' ability to fly for up to 2 weeks at a time, to figure out how crafts would dock to each other around the Earth and the Moon, perfect their re-entry and landing techniques, and to understand the effects of long flights on astronauts. Alexei Lyubimov achieved the first spacewalk for the Soviet Union, lasting 12 minutes and 9 seconds on March 18th, 1965, on the Vostok 2. On June 3rd, 1965, Ed White performed the first American spacewalk during the Gemini 4 mission, 77 days later than the Soviet Union. On March 16, 1966, during the Gemini 8 mission with astronauts Neil Armstrong and David Scott, the first docking between two crafts was achieved when they docked with another craft that was launched earlier that day. The Apollo 11 spacecraft was launched on July 24, 1969, with a mission to land on the moon, holding Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. During the mission, the craft malfunctioned often. A lunar module named the Eagle had to be manually landed on the moon. On July 20th, 1969, the Eagle landed on the moon, and Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. Then he said the famous line,
I'm going to step off the limb. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Also, all Soviet moon landing attempts between 1969 and 1972 failed. America had won the space race, but because of the completion of the space race, interest in lunar missions severely died down and it was no longer the main focus. On July 15th, 1975, an Apollo spacecraft launched carrying Thomas P. Stafford, Vance D. Brand, and Deke Slayton. On July 17th, 1975, a Soviet craft launched carrying Alexei Lyovov, who was the first to achieve a spacewalk, and Valery Kubasov. The two crafts then docked, which was the first joint space mission ever, and it was done between the US and Soviet Union. However, not all of the space race was sunshine and rainbows. There were those that lost their lives during the missions, some completely unnecessarily. On July 27, 1967, astronauts Virgil Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaff all died of asphyxiation in a flash fire in the command module of Apollo 204 during a simulated launch at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station in Florida. It happened because of a stray spark that started a fire in the pure oxygen environment inside the module. Design flaws made in the hatch door made it impossible to open in time to save the 3 astronauts. NASA later designated this mission as Apollo 1. 3 months later, on April 24, 1967, Soviet astronaut Vladimir Komarov became the first fatality in spaceflight. The Soyuz 1 was aimed at eventually reaching the moon. Instead, it crashed into the Earth. The Soyuz 1 was still in experimental stages and problems began about 9 minutes after launch. One of the solar panels did not deploy, which cut the power to the spacecraft and interfered with its controls. The mission was then aborted, but a difficult re-entry into Earth's atmosphere prevented Komarov from escaping the spacecraft before it crashed into the Earth in southeastern Russia, as the Soyuz 1 parachutes did not deploy correctly. Russia launched the first ever space station, the Salyut 1, in April 1971, and later in June 1971, 3 Russian astronauts aboard the Soyuz 11 spent 3 weeks conducting experiments and observations at the space station. On their return trip on June 30th, the spacecraft made a normal re-entry and a perfect automatic landing. However, after the Soyuz 11 landed on the ground and the ground team opened the hatch, they found all 3 astronauts unresponsive. A faulty air vent had opened when the orbital descent modules of Soyuz 11 separated and the cabin had depressurized. The cosmonauts suffocated to death 30 minutes before landing, as they weren't wearing their spacesuits. As a legacy of the Soyuz 11 tragedy, the Soviet and US would learn from their mistakes, and their space programs would pass requirements ensuring their cosmonauts and astronauts wear spacesuits during any phases of a mission where depressurization could occur. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart 73 seconds after its launch from Cape Canaveral, crashing into the Atlantic Ocean from an altitude of roughly 50,000 feet. All 7 astronauts aboard were killed, including Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher who had been selected as part of a National Teacher in Space initiative. In a later investigation, it was found that NASA had known that extremely cold temperatures could result in damage to the spacecraft's rubber O-rings, which separated its rocket boosters and prevented fuel leaks. But they elected to do the launch in the cold weather anyway, which prompted outrage and the temporary suspension of the Space Shuttle program for willingly sending a group of people to their deaths. For both superpowers, reaching the stars was more than just a scientific achievement. It was a powerful symbol of national prestige and the strength of their ideologies.
The Cold War was an era defined by tension, distrust, and the looming shadow of nuclear annihilation. Between the years of 1947 and 1991, 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, would engage in a fierce competition that would shape the future of the world, the arms race. At the heart of this race was the quest for military supremacy. It wasn't just about technology or power. It was a battle for ideological dominance, capitalism versus communism, democracy versus dictatorship. And in this competition, the weapon of choice was the bomb. In 1945, the world witnessed the unimaginable. The United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, effectively ending World War II and showcasing the power of nuclear weapons. But this new power also marked the beginning of a new kind of war, one not fought on battlefields, but in laboratories, boardrooms, and political corridors. For the Soviet Union, the need to catch up was immediate. In 1949, just 4 years after the United States, the Soviet Union detonated its first bomb, codenamed First Lightning. The race was on, and the stakes were higher than ever. As the 1950s unfolded, both sides scrambled to build bigger, more powerful weapons. The United States unveiled the hydrogen bomb in 1952, an even more devastating weapon than the atomic bomb. Just 1 year later, though, the Soviets followed suit. With each new development, the world moved closer to the unthinkable: total annihilation. By 1962, the Cold War reached its most dangerous point, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union had secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just about 144 kilometers off the coast of Florida. For 13 days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war until a secret deal was made between John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. It was a dramatic reminder of the consequences of the arms race, but it was also a turning point. Leaders on both sides knew that the race couldn't continue unchecked. If one side had attacked the other, then they would hurl towards mutually assured destruction. In the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, both superpowers recognized the need for some form of restraint. In 1963, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed, prohibiting nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. It was a small step, but a step nonetheless toward easing tensions. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, arms control efforts intensified. The SALT talks, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, and later the INF Treaty, all aimed at limiting the number of nuclear weapons each side could hold. But even as both sides negotiated, the arms race continued to drive technological advancements in missile defense, nuclear warheads, and strategic weaponry. At home, the race sparked fear and protest. Citizens in both countries, especially in the United States and Western Europe, became increasingly alarmed at the prospect of nuclear war. Anti-nuclear movements grew, calling for disarmament and greater accountability from world leaders. The arms race and Cold War tensions began to thaw with the end of the 1980s. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union, the rise of a new era in international diplomacy, and the eventual collapse of the Soviet regime led to a dramatic shift. The arms race, once the driving force of global politics, finally slowed to a halt.
Right after World War II, France, the US, and the UK split Germany with Russia. The Allies split up West Germany while Russia had East Germany, but the US also got the west side of Berlin, which was about 160 kilometers inside of East Germany. Berliners could freely travel between East and West Berlin, allowing them to see the economic differences in the two countries, where America seemed thriving with no restrictions on what you could watch, read, or listen to, while East Berlin, under Soviet rule, seemed to be much more of a hovel in comparison, where there were heavy restrictions on what you could do, and everyone was struggling financially in comparison. In response to seeing his people leaving to thrive in West Berlin instead of staying in East Berlin, Stalin blocked all of the supply lines to West Berlin, the Berlin Blockade in 1948. However, America then airdropped all the supplies that West Berlin needed in the Berlin Airlift, which lasted from 1948 to 1949. Stalin then ended the Berlin blockade on May 12, 1949. In the Berlin Airlift, there were a grand total of 277,804 flights and 2.3 million tons of supplies delivered. Things didn't change much until after John F. Kennedy was elected in 1960. But the contrast between the two sides of Berlin became even more apparent, as the Soviet Union was putting most of its money into the military and space race. The economic state of the people in the Soviet Union was a mess. Because of this, millions of people elected to just stay in West Berlin, or travel into West Germany via West Berlin, instead of traveling between the two Berlins. The lack of workers in East Berlin from the mass defections caused factories to slow, which took another heavy toll on the economy. Then on August 13, 1961, Berlin was forcibly cut into two, completely separated by Soviet guards and barbed wire until the Berlin Wall was completed. To the despair of all Berliners, West Berlin couldn't do anything to stop East Berlin from the wall being built and the two sides being split off. Hundreds died trying to make their way to West Berlin as the guards on the wall were ordered to shoot anyone trying to cross over the border on sight. In response, John F. Kennedy said,
And democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us.
Although US diplomats were still allowed through the border, Berlin crossing guards stopped letting the diplomats through. Then in October 1961, US tanks went to the crossing point at Checkpoint Charlie as a show of the US's strength. The Soviets responded by bringing their own tanks to the same checkpoint. They then stayed in a standoff for about 16 hours, until eventually they inched away from each other and left altogether. East Germans flocked to Hungary, to be able to go through their open borders to get to West Germany. And under the new Russian leader, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, passage was allowed between the two sides of Germany and Berlin. Because of this, on November 4th, 1989, 500,000 East Germans took to the streets as the Berlin Wall was announced to get taken down. And on November 9th, 1989, the travel ban between East and West Berlin was to be lifted. Although the change wasn't supposed to take effect until the next day, huge crowds of people gathered at the crossing points and overwhelmed the crossing guards, who still had orders to shoot anyone trying to cross on sight. But because of the sheer number of people, they were let through. East and West Berliners celebrated through the night. People climbed and toppled the Berlin Wall. And by 1990, Germany was completely unified. The peaceful end of the Wall's division symbolized the collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe and heralded the end of the Cold War. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, marking the definitive end of the Cold War. The world, once divided by two superpowers, found itself in a new era of unipolarity, with the United States as the dominant global power. The Cold War shaped the 20th century in ways that continue to affect our world today. It forged the modern geopolitical landscape, and its legacy can be seen in conflicts that still endure, whether in the Middle East, the rise of China, or tensions with Russia. The fear of nuclear war, though reduced, still lingers, and the global arms race continues in different forms. More than just a political struggle, the Cold War had profound effects on global economies and society. The space race and arms race fueled technological innovations that still shape our daily lives, from satellites to computer technologies. The ideological divide between East and West left a mark on cultures, societies, and individuals, influencing everything from literature and film to political discourse and national identity. The Cold War may have ended, but its impact endures. In an increasingly interconnected world, the Cold War's lessons remain relevant. The pursuit of power, technological superiority, and ideological dominance continues to shape our international relations. And as we look to the future, we are reminded that history is never truly finished, and the Cold War's legacy is still with us, in ways both visible and hidden. The Cold War may have divided the world, but it also helped shape a new global order, and how that order evolves will depend on the choices we make today.